Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chris Woolforth. I'm the Acting Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon and to introduce you to today's event and to our speaker, Professor Thomas Pogge. For 30 years, the Dickey Center for International Understanding has perpetuated the dedication of Dartmouth's 12th president, John Sloan Dickey, to encouraging global engagement by the Dartmouth community. For nearly 10 of those years, we have honored the legacy of his Great Issues course by highlighting pertinent international issues of the day through our Great Issues Lecture series. Today's Great Issue Lecture fits very well in the tradition of important international issues. Global inequality is a topic that our students and community approach with great passion and commitment, as well as at times great confusion. Motivated by a strong idealistic desire to change the world for the better, and at times the process of coming to understand why so many of the world's population suffer in poverty, while such a small proportion disproportionately benefit from the Earth's resources, can be a depressing and dispiriting process. The process is all more complex because while global inequity is fundamentally a moral problem, most of the research and work on it is of a pragmatic or logistical nature. Our speaker today should help us address this disequilibrium and furnish us with some hope that we can address global justice problems both morally and pragmatically at the same time. Thomas Pogge is a unique combination of academic and activist. A political philosopher by training, he began his scholarly career by tackling the largest of problems in moral philosophy, global justice. I might add that he did this by writing a PhD dissertation on Kant, Rawls, and global justice with none other than John Rawls himself. His subsequent work has been no less bold. His philosophical work problematizes everything related to global justice, from how we measure who is poor and what poverty is in the first place, to the many complicated and morally challenging proposed solutions to that poverty. He does not stop at a conception of positive justice for the poor, that is, support by the wealthy through charity and the like, but rather goes further by calling for the dismantling of the very global institutional order that perpetuates unequal distribution of the Earth's resources to a discrete few. As I say, Pogge is unique in that he doesn't stop at philosophizing, but has put his philosophy into action by founding an organization that addresses one aspect of global poverty, of which he'll speak about today. After receiving his PhD from Harvard, Professor Pogge taught at Columbia University before moving in 2008 to Yale University as the Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs. He has recently been a professorial fellow at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at Australian National University and maintains associations at the Center for the Study of Mind and Nature at the University of Oslo and at the Center for Professional Ethics at the University of Central Lancashire. He's written 11 books, edited or co-edited 16 others, and penned over 100 articles. All of these are conveniently organized on his website according to subject and broken down to scholarly audiences and general audiences, so if you're looking for the right thing, I'm sure you'll find it there. His work appears in 21 languages to date. He travels extensively, having given, again according to his website, some 896 lectures in 44 different countries. He has supervised or co-supervised 55 doctoral dissertations. In his spare time, he founded the Health Impact Fund, which is the subject of his presentation today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pogge.
This works? Does it work? Is it amplified?
Yeah.
Good. So this is actually the 900th lecture, believe it or not. So I didn't think that you would dig this information out, but it's...
If you didn't put it on your website,
no, amazing. Okay, good. So the world is good in Hanover, New Hampshire. Things are going well here, but if you look a little bit more broadly, things don't look so well, right? We have all sorts of worries and headaches. We have, for example, a big problem with poverty in the world. We have a big problem with health, global health. We have problems with dangerous technologies that may sooner or later come to bite us or our successors. And we have ecological problems, resource depletion and global warming being the most prominent of those. So the question is, and we're all sort of a little worried, we are all living under a cloud to some extent, even if we live in lovely Hanover. And so the question is, what exactly is going on? How can we explain, how can we understand these problems and why they persist? And even more importantly, is there anything that we can do, we being 1/7 billionth of the world's population, is there anything we can do to change things? So that's what I asked myself. And so I run by you a few of my amateurish thoughts about changing the world, understanding how it works, and seeing where the soft spots are, where we can actually make a difference. So I'm trying to use this clever machine, since this is a talk on something. Good. So start with something that you're all familiar with, some very simple thoughts. We all are trained to praise markets, competitive systems, adversarial systems. You learned that in Economics 101 if you haven't learned it before, that markets are very good. They elicit the best efforts of their participants. They get things done. They bring forth, people reveal their true capacities and so on. And our world is one that just revolves around these competitive systems. We have financial markets, the business world, politics is competitively organized, academia, of course, the media, international relations. We find this competitive adversarial model everywhere. And indeed, it can be hugely effective if properly framed. So the capitalist system, if you like, has been incredibly successful in unfolding human creativity and productive forces. And what this means, what proper framing means, is basically the rules have to be properly designed so that the competition really does reward what is socially valuable. So, for example, that those professors who are the best teachers do get rewarded, or those companies that produce the best products and so on. So socially valuable outcomes have to be the focus of the rules. The rules have to track that. And the rules have to be administered correctly so that there's an impartial, accurate assessment of how socially valuable things are. And when you have that, then competitive systems are really quite wonderful. But as we all know, competitive systems have an Achilles heel. They contain the seeds of their own destruction. And that is that there are two different ways in which you can get ahead in a competition. One is you do what the rules say that they will reward, and you do it well, better than others, and you get rewarded. The other thing is that you try to corrupt the rules, bend the rules in your own favor, or those who are applying the rules. So that means that there's always a danger in competitive systems that the rules themselves and those who apply these rules become objects of the competition, that the competition isn't any longer over the ball, but over the umpire, so to speak, in sports metaphor. That's an Achilles heel that makes competitive systems, potentially at least, much less effective than they could be. And that is so for two reasons. The first is that resources that are invested in lobbying and gaming and influencing the umpires are lost to the system. So instead of hiring 100 really good engineers to build a better airplane, Boeing is hiring 100 lobbyists to descend upon Washington and to influence your congresspeople. And secondly, insofar as such gaming, lobbying, and so on succeeds, of course, the competition and its rules lose track of what is really socially valuable. Because these lobbyists will then, of course, try to persuade the procurement people or the Congress to acquire maybe a weapon system that the country doesn't really need or something of that sort. So we are not really rewarding anymore the socially most valuable outcomes. Now, this is all well known. It is under the heading of regulatory capture, much discussed. Manco Olson is a major figure in that field. Now, one thing that follows from this regulatory capture is, I think, the danger of what I call inequality spirals. Inequality spirals occur because people are differently positioned to lobby. And that is so because people who are rich and advantaged have better lobbying opportunities, and they also have stronger incentives to lobby. They have stronger incentives to lobby because they have much more at stake. So if I have an income in the millions of dollars, then every little change in the tax rate is going to be worth a lot of money to me. If I've got the kind of small income that I have, it's not really worth my while to try to send people to Washington to try to change the tax rate for me. To be sure, I could try to band up with a lot of other philosophy professors or professors in general and see whether we together can buy some lobbyists, but there are lots of transaction costs involved and so on. So the stronger people, the people who are already more advantaged, already richer, have better opportunities to lobby and also stronger incentives to lobby. It's much easier to get 6 hedge fund managers together to lobby jointly in Washington than to get 6,000 professors together. And that's why I suppose we have a special tax rate for hedge fund managers and no special tax rate for professors. You all know that, right? That hedge fund managers pay 15% maximum taxes because they're taxed at the capital gains rate, even though they don't have their own money at stake. They're simply providing a service. They manage money for other people, but it's taxed at 15% maximum tax rate, while we pay a maximum of, I think, 36% at this point. So, and every year the Congress debates that and says, this is really quite unjust, and then they vote, and then it passes again. Guess why? It's an election year, I hardly have to remind you. Okay, so inequality spirals, the idea is that those who are at the top of the income distribution have better opportunities, better experience, knowledge, know-how in lobbying. They use that obviously for their own benefit. And that means that in the next round, the rules will be slightly more favorable to them, which allows them to capture an even larger piece of the pie, which in turn makes them even more able to lobby, which in turn, and so on, you get the drift. So there's an inequality spiral that can easily happen and increase inequalities. Now, this phenomenon of inequality spirals is particularly threatening at the supranational level, I think. This level of institutional design, which has opened up in recent years, the last 20 years or so, we have had, after the wall came down, after the end of the Cold War, a major push where many of the rules that govern our day-to-day interactions have been shifted upward from the nation level to the supranational level. And at the supranational level, lobbying is much easier. And the reason for that is that at the supranational level, there is no democracy. There's no democratic counterweight, right? Within our country and most other countries, it's very difficult for rich people to lobby all the way, to really lobby unopposed. Because if things get too bad, then the ordinary people will become restive. You get an Occupy Wall Street movement. You get people forming maybe new parties or invading old parties and so on. You get resistance. And you get something like the French Revolution, perhaps even, where some heads roll. But in the international arena, there's very little of a democratic, in fact, there's no democratic counterweight, no real revolutionary potential. So even if all the people in Africa don't like the way the world is run, there isn't a hell of a lot that they can do about it. And further, there's also at the international level, as it's now organized, very little transparency. So if we have a law pending in the Congress, we know ahead of time what the law is. We can study it. If we don't like it, we can write editorials, we can organize demonstrations, whatever. We can try to make our displeasure felt, write to our congressperson. But at the international level, you don't know ahead of time what these people are negotiating. The negotiations take place behind closed doors. The results get then announced. If there is a treaty, you can read it up afterwards. But even afterwards, it's very difficult to figure out how certain language got into the treaty text, who wanted what sort of constellation of forces and bargaining positions resulted in the text that you see. Governments come home and they tell their people, this was the best that we could do. And we basically take it. Another thing that is unique about the international arena is that moral concerns can relatively easily be sidelined, much more easily than domestically, by simply saying that, well, of course, we are very concerned about morality, but you know what? We are competing with these other guys over there. Lately, the Chinese, it used to be the Soviet Union. Have you heard, by the way, that the Chinese are now in Africa and that they are not sort of doing moral things there? It's a big scandal, that. Anyway, so the Chinese, of course, will say the same things about us. They will say that we cannot be relied upon to act morally, and so they cannot afford to compete morally, to be moral in international affairs. So this competition downplays or allows countries to downplay the moral concerns that normally should bar them from doing certain things. So all this, I think, amounts to the following, that if you have a lot of money to invest in lobbying, the very best way to lobby now, the very best thing to try to buy at this point is supranational rules. This supranational architecture is now emerging. It's in the last 20 years that we've seen a big explosion of rules and regulations and treaties and so on, conventions at the supranational level. And now, if you have money to invest it there, try to create favorable rules at the supranational level that will then pay enormous dividends. And also try to support the shift that is already ongoing from the national to the supranational level, because there your bang for the buck is going to be magnified. And I think that's what we've seen in recent years, in particular in a concentration of lobbying on the US. The US is really the softest target for lobbying, for the reason that it is, on the one hand, I should go back here, on the one hand, it is a country that is still very, very powerful in international affairs, and on the other hand, it is a country that has a system, a political system, in which money plays a very, very private money, plays a very strong role. So our elections here are essentially privately funded, and so politicians depend on money coming into the electoral system. So again, a very easy way to influence decision-making is through the US government, supranational decision-making. So if there were anything to the story, then what you would expect to find is that those in a position to lobby the US government should have done really well in the last 20 years or so of globalization, of increasing global governance. And this is actually what we find. So we find that in the US, there has been a major shift in the income distribution in favor of the rich, and in particular in favor of the very richest. So these figures, I've been showing them around for a number of years, but now pretty much everybody has seen them. They're from the Internal Revenue Service. And they show you that the bottom half has lost a lot of ground, more than half of their share of national household income. But what's particularly striking is that the gains have been so very, very concentrated at the top. And the top is the top 1%, and even the top 10th of 1%, or the top 100th of a percent, which now has 6.04% of national household income. So it's quite a dramatic increase in inequality. And you can see here that this top 100%, 14,400 tax returns, these guys now have nearly half as much income as the bottom half of the US population, and about 2/3 as much income as the bottom half of world population, 3.5 billion people. So it's really a tremendous inequality in income. The wealth inequality is even greater because rich people have normally much more than one annual income worth of wealth, whereas poor people normally have much less. So it is a fantastic increase in inequality. You all know about the Kuznets curve, right? Economics textbooks tells you inequality tends to go up as a country matures and then goes down as the country becomes more mature. That's exactly what happened in the US until 1978, and then inequality shot back up and is now at levels that match the height in just before the Great Depression. Now, how does it look globally? This is the global income distribution as of 1988 in exchange rate weighted terms. And what you see here is this is the top 5% of the world's population, the next 20%, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. Sorry, this is a little bit cut off here. So, and what I show you now is how that changed over the subsequent 17 years. These are data from Branko Milanovic at the World Bank. And can you see that? I do it one more time. So the top ventile, the top 5%, gained 3.5% of global household income, and all the other parts of the world's population lost. In fact, the second ventile stayed roughly equal, and all the others lost. And what you can also see is that the bottom quarter lost the most. They lost about 1/3 of their share of global household income. So globally as well, there has been a tremendous increase in inequality in incomes across the world's population, with, again, the gains very heavily concentrated at the top. So exactly what this regulatory capture idea would predict. Now that has consequences. If the size of the slice in terms of its angle of the poor decreases by a third, then obviously rising average income in the world is not going to help the poor keep up with or maintain their own income. And you can see here the data from the Food and Agriculture Organization about hunger in the world, significant increases since 1996. I've marked that in red not only because it's the low point, but also because that was the year of the World Food Summit in Rome, when the assembled governments promised that they would halve this number by 2015. You all know the number 2015 probably from the Millennium Development Goals, and the Millennium Development Goals were later much, much weaker, much diluted statements of the same goals, halving the proportion of people in the developing world since 1990 and so on. So a much more convoluted formulation that makes this phenomenon here look a little better, but still it's quite clear that no matter how you express it, we have not done well. We haven't halved anything as far as chronically undernourished people are concerned. So, and of course, still we have a third of all human deaths occurring from poverty-related causes. And this is a very conservative estimate that, as you can see here, counts only those causes of death that are basically unknown in the rich countries. So simply counting those gets you to 18 million or 1/3. And then you have to add to those people who die from the very causes that we die from, except that they die sooner because of lousy medical care or disease vectors in their environment or something like that. I haven't counted any of those to get to the 1/3 figure. So what do we get out of this in terms of imperatives, in terms of what should we do, how can we make progress? The first thing to understand is that this is not all about helping in the Peter Singer mode. We should do more to help. Yeah, sure, we should do more to help, but we should also do less harm or stop harming. So a great deal of the problem is a design of global institutional arrangements, supranational institutional arrangements that are designed with tender loving care for the rich, because they are the ones who can lobby. And the rich don't hate the poor, don't get me wrong, but they love themselves, and so they try to get as large a slice of the pizza as they can. And as the rich get a larger slice, well, sorry, there's going to be less left over for the poor. It's just mathematics. So here are some of the examples that I've analyzed in my work about supranational institutional arrangements that do particular harm to the poor, that are particularly inhospitable to the poor. And I won't go through them all in detail. I can quickly mention illicit financial flows is large amounts of money that get siphoned out of the poor countries every year through all sorts of tax evasion and corruption schemes, tax havens, and so forth. The US is also a tax haven where a lot of money gets parked by dictators and corrupt officials. But of course, there are tons and tons of these tax havens around. That's about $1 trillion right there, 8 times as much as all development assistance, of which only 1/8 in turn is spent on actually addressing poverty. So 64 times as much as the money that we spend on poverty eradication flows out every year from the poor countries into the richer countries in these illicit ways. And so we ask ourselves, why doesn't our development assistance do more good? Well, there is a counterflow that is just much larger. For privileges, we recognize very unsavory regimes the world over as entitled to sell us the natural resources of their countries and to borrow money in their country's name, money for which the population is then held responsible, thereby making it possible for these dictators to stay in power and thereby punishing the poor people of these countries twice over. Namely, on the one hand, their resources are being sold off by their dictators, and on the other hand, the dictators get fed money that they can then use to continue to oppress the population. So that's another very big problem for poor populations. Now, we are, through our governments, involved in both designing and upholding these supranational rules, and insofar as they are unjust and harmful of the poor, we bear some responsibility alongside many citizens of many other countries, richer countries, influential countries, for these harms. And that is where this do no harm comes in. We have to understand that this is even more urgent than it would be if it were just a matter of not helping enough. The second imperative is that we should aim not to reduce poverty in all these funny, clever ways that the Millennium Development Goals have outlined. What we ought to do is eradicate poverty. We should eradicate it completely, aim for the eradication. The Millennium Development Goals, just to give you one example, the baseline is 1990, the target date is 2015. They want to halve, as I said, this funny proportion, which amounts to a 27% reduction in the number of chronically undernourished people and in the number of extremely poor people. A 27% reduction over 25 years is basically 1% per year. That's the seriousness with which we take poverty and malnutrition. We are reducing it 1% a year. Why not simply wipe it out? And you will say, well, it's much too expensive, right? So many people are hungry, so many people are poor. And you can see here, you're right, so many people. Here you see it in millions. 3 billion people live below the World Bank's $2.50 per day poverty line. This is purchasing power adjusted. So this is, they live on less than what $2.50 could buy in the US in 2005. So yes, these are very, very large numbers. But now look at how much the shortfall of these people actually amounts to in terms of dollars. And you'll see that these are small amounts. It's $500 billion even at the highest of these poverty lines. And $500 billion is 2/3 of the US military budget, just one country's military budget. So it's 0.8% of world income or 1.3% of global household income, just the income of households. So these are not large amounts. Think of the Second World War, where catastrophic things were happening in Europe, and the Allies were spending about half of their gross national incomes at the height of the war on fighting Hitler and fighting the Japanese. Half, 50% of GNP. Now here we're talking about 1.3% of household income or 0.8% of the world's GNP. So it's a very, very much smaller amount. And the damage, as I showed you, the 18 million people dying each year, is actually more than died in the worst part of the Second World War, which killed about 60 million people. So I'm not saying the Second World War wasn't serious. It was very serious, and it deserved the money that was spent on it and the blood that was spilled for it. But the world poverty problem is as large or larger, and we are more directly implicated in the catastrophe, and we can solve it at a much, much, much lower cost. So if we shifted these 1.3% of global household income, this is the picture as it looks now in 2005, actually, the latest year for which we have good figures, then the bottom half of the world's population, which now have about 2.9% of global household income, they would have 4.2% of global household income. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, shouldn't the bottom half, of course we deserve 95% or more of global household income, but the top half. But shouldn't the bottom half at least get 4.2%? Is this asking too much? Is this somehow too extravagant? Is that something that we should not try to make happen? Good. The third imperative is that we have to move from detached goals like the MDGs to agreed upon responsibilities. The MDGs, and few people notice that, are goals that are no goals of anybody in particular. They just say it would be a good thing if X happened and if Y happened and so on. But nobody is addressed by these goals. Nobody is told that they ought to do something. These are not the goals of anybody. They're just goals, free-floating, detached goals. And so what we need is goals that are given to particular people, a division of tasks, a division of labor, real responsibilities, so that when we miss the glide path, when poverty isn't coming down the way we expected, that then certain responsibilities kick in. So then now this country has to do this, and they have to do more, and so on, so that we have actually some assurance that we are meeting these goals. And of course, the goals have to be much more ambitious, as I said, under the previous point. And finally, what we should also do is mainstream beyond ODA. So the global institutional architecture, these supranational rules and practices, you can divide them into two parts. One part is ODA, Official Development Assistance. That's a very, very tiny part in terms of money, in terms of effect and so on, a very, very tiny part. of this huge emerging supranational architecture. And that's where all the attention is focused when we talk about poverty. So when somebody talks about poverty, people say, he wants more development aid, he wants more effective development aid, whatever. But what I'm saying is, sure, we want all of that, but let's look at the other 99.8% of this supranational architecture, which also has very powerful distributional effects. And let's see whether we cannot do something to minimize the detrimental effects of that part, this much larger part of the supranational rules, in favor of the poor. And then we may not need any development assistance. Maybe the poor could get along quite well on their own if only the rules were not blowing such a strong headwind into their faces. Might also be much cheaper, rather than first causing damage that benefits us and then trying to rectify it, to take the interests of the poor into account when we shape the basic rules. So that leads to the basic solution, or the basic idea for a solution, that the interests of the majority of the human population have to be taken into account in institutional design more broadly. We need structural reforms that reduce poverty and inequality, that can hopefully find some political support also among our elites who have more or less the monopoly on political power, that are scalable and replicable so that if they succeed to some extent, they can be scaled up. And finally, that they bring further reforms within reach. So that's the basic idea. The basic idea is to change the game, focus on the larger structures, try to implement reforms that are more pro-poor, and thereby create a model that can then thrive and proliferate throughout the institutional structure. What is helpful here in asking where should we start, what is a good way of getting reform going, is to think that moral forces, moral motivations in the world are too weak on their own to achieve much against the concerted resistance of self-interested players. So what we need to do to make headway is to make common cause with some of the elite players who have prudential interests in supporting us. So the worst thing you can do here is to think of the elites as a big black box, homogeneous, everybody having the same interests and so on. They don't. They have very much conflicting and competing interests. And by understanding how these interests vary and differ, we can actually take advantage of them and add our force to some forces in order then to defeat others. So what can help here is analyzing these prudential incentives, first to realize that these agents are often competing with each other, and so if we can find ways of reducing their position slightly in a way that doesn't change their relative position vis-a-vis each other, that's much easier to achieve than reforms that would reduce the competitive position of some but not their competitors. Secondly, there is an instability that threatens when rules are subject to be purchased by the highest bidder, which is essentially what happens with supranational rules. The banks buy themselves the rules governing the financial system and so forth. And so what happens is that you get an ill-designed, incoherent architecture of rules which is prone to inefficiencies and crises. That is in one sense bad, as we saw in 2008 with the global financial crisis, but it's also in another sense good because it shows that there is the potential of a win-win, that even the elite players may have more to gain from a reduction in their influence than from maintaining their powerful position. So there may well be a kind of collective action problem at work where what is good for each, namely to have more influence, more lobbying power, is bad for them collectively in that they have more risks and dangers from the lobbying capacity of others and the incoherence that results than the benefit that they get from successful lobbying for their own interests. A third point is that there are divergences in the interests of powerful agents, and so we can, for example, find a reform that is opposed by the pharmaceutical industry but supported by the insurance industry. There could be ways of exploiting that. And finally, there's also the principal agent problems we might exploit. So by front-loading the benefits of a particular reform for companies, we would disproportionately benefit the present leaders of these companies, especially the CEOs. And then if the problems or the costs for the companies come later, then that's bad for the company, but it's not very bad for the CEO. So we can exploit these principal agent problems by front-loading benefits and back-loading costs. So here's, given all these considerations, here's the idea that I came up with that seems to me to be a very good, ambitious, but not overly ambitious first domino to tackle. Something that is pretty obvious morally, can gather a lot of prudential support, and would be a real game changer by opening up opportunities for further reform. So start with the fact that the present system for the production of pharmaceuticals in innovation and production is not very old. It actually came into existence in the mid-90s through the so-called TRIPS agreement, which was made part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Intellectual property has nothing much to do with trade on the face of it, but it was something that the rich countries managed to demand as a condition for opening their own markets to products from the developing world, that they said, you have to do something for us, you have to better protect our intellectual property. Stronger intellectual property protections, and that was particularly noticeable in the area of pharmaceuticals. Before TRIPS came along, many poor countries had very weak intellectual property protections or none at all. India, for example, had process patents. Process patents protect a way of making a molecule, but not the molecule itself. And clever Indian generic companies invented around the patents and produced very cheaply important new advanced medicines, selling them to poor people in India and all over the developing world. Now, with product patents, that path is closed, and so now poor patients no longer get access to recently invented and still patented medicines. All countries that are members of the WTO, except the very least developed, which have no manufacturing capacity, so it's irrelevant, all of them are now under this 20-year product patent regime. Now, how do we assess that regime? I think there are three very obvious principles, moral principles, that you want to use to assess any system for the innovation and procurement of pharmaceuticals. First, you want, because medicines are very cheap to produce, by that I mean that the millionth pill, cranking out the millionth pill out of your factory or something is very, very cheap. The ingredients are relatively cheap. Mass production is relatively cheap. So given how cheap it is to make more of the stuff, you want all important medicines to be available to everyone, whether they are rich or poor, regardless of where they may live, and so on. Secondly, you want research and development into new medicines to track the disease burden. You want it to go after the most cost-effective health gains. So you want researchers to look out for where they can make the greatest difference. You want effectiveness or efficiency. And further, you want the whole system to be effective and efficient in the sense that as much as possible of the money that is spent on buying medicines flows right back into innovation and into the production, the manufacture of medicines. You don't want money to go to waste. Now, given these three desiderata, how is our system doing? How is the TRIPS system doing? Universal access, we're doing quite poorly because prices of new medicines are quite high, often 40, 50 times the cost of production. And so lots and lots of people cannot get access. If you ask why that is so, this curve, I think, presents a good answer. Let's see whether I get this little, yeah, it works. So there's a lot of inequality in the world. We saw that earlier. And the inequality will affect the demand curve. The demand curve shows you, depending on what price you charge, how many units of the product you will sell. And so the demand curve you can see here is steeply sloping, right? We are here to the left. We are in the rich part of the human population. And if we are really, really sick and there's a drug out there that can really, really help us, we pay $100, we pay $1,000, we pay $5,000. Right? We pay what we can. So does everybody else, except that they can't. They're poor. And so the demand curve has a steep part here and then falls off sharply. And here, and so what you are doing as a monopolist in order to maximize profit, you say, well, I fix my price, let's say at $50, and then I go over to the demand curve, and this is my profit, this rectangle, down to the cost line, and you're trying to maximize your profit. You get to choose the price, and then the demand curve does everything else, determines how large your rectangle is. And you can see right off the bat geometrically here that you want to charge a very, very high price, right? Lowering to, let's say, $20, yeah, you get more customers, but the rectangle is going to be a lot smaller than what it would be if you charged a very high price. And the same is increasingly true also within countries. So even if you could perfectly price discriminate and have, there's obviously parallel import problems, smuggling problems and so on, but even if you could sell at very different prices in different countries, the optimal price for just India alone would be one that would price 80% of the population out of the competition. So that's the first problem. The present system, rewarding innovators by allowing them to charge what they want for their product, is a system that denies access to these new drugs to a very large majority of the human population. A second problem regards focused innovation, right? We wanted innovation to go after the diseases that cause the greatest problems, where the most cost-effective gains can be achieved. And we don't have that either, because diseases that are concentrated among the poor are diseases that innovators will not want to touch, because there you cannot make a lot of money. Either you price it so that the poor can afford it, then you will sell many, many units, but at very low margin, or you price it in the usual way with a 30 times markup, in which case you will not have any customers. So you make much more money on a hair loss medicine than on a malaria product or schistosomiasis or tropical diseases, whatever, simply because those products you can mark up and you have customers who have the money to pay for these markups. And thirdly, overall efficiency is also quite weak under the present system, because so much of the money that pharmaceutical companies rake in goes not for new medicine innovation, nor for the production of medicines, not even for profits for the pharmaceutical companies, that is also quite plentiful, but it goes for litigation, it goes for marketing and so on, for expenses that are ultimately quite wasteful. So the Health Impact Fund is an idea that tries to change TRIPS without changing TRIPS. So it's very difficult to change the TRIPS agreement or the WTO treaty because you need unanimity within the WTO. But you can change things sometimes without changing the treaty text itself, simply by subverting it in some other way. And that's what the Health Impact Fund is trying to do. So it's a complement to the TRIPS agreement, which offers innovators the chance to register any new product that they might want to bring to the market for health impact rewards. There are annual pools, let's say $6 billion each, and these pools get divided up among registered products each year according to their health impact. So if your product is registered and accounts for 8% of the health impact of all the registered products, then in that year you get 8% of the pool. The next year is a new ball game. We look again what percentage of the health impact is due to your medicine, and we pay you that percentage of the next pool. That goes on for 10 years. At the end of the 10 years, you've got your reward, and you drop off, and the product goes generic. Now, what do you have to do? Obviously, you don't get these rewards for nothing. What you have to do in order to get these rewards is you have to give up your pricing power. And that means that you have to sell the product everywhere in the world at cost. So you make no money at all on the manufacture and sale of the product. You make all your money through health impact rewards. So it's basically another way of rewarding you for having had this wonderful idea, for having achieved this innovation, rather than rewarding you by giving you the chance to mark up your product unmolested by competitors. We now give you the chance to harvest health impact rewards proportional to the health impact that your product actually achieves. If you have a hair loss product, you're not going to want the reward, right? You're going to stay right where you are in the patent track. But if you have a schistosomiasis or malaria product, you may very well want to come over to the Health Impact Fund and get rewarded on the basis of health impact. Now, how do we know what the cost is, the cost of production? Do we ask the pharma companies and say, so how much does it cost? No, we don't. What we do instead is we ask the pharma company that registers a product to put it out for tender among competing generic manufacturers, and then to accept the lowest 2 or 3 reliable bidders. They produce the world production, they manufacture the stuff, they sell it at the pre-agreed price, the tender price, to the innovator, and the innovator then sells it on at exactly that same price to wholesalers in the various countries. So again, the innovator makes no money at all on the manufacture and sale of the products. All they get paid for is the actual health impact achieved by the product in the 10-year period. This is our advisory board. I put this up mainly for one name that's on there. Maybe you can recognize that person, this one, who is, I hear, going on to bigger and better things, even than Dartmouth. And so hopefully can do something big and wonderful for us. But you can see this is a pretty good list, you know. So I would look pretty odd if I were on that list as a little dwarf. But anyway. So, but it's good that all these people thought the idea was worth supporting. And you shouldn't be impressed by that. You should be impressed by the arguments. But still, this is politically very useful to have these people here. Good. So the Health Impact Fund also boosts the cost effectiveness. That was the third criterion that I mentioned, right? Because we are reducing a huge amount of waste. This is very important because I want to have something to say to the rich populations why they should support this. This is not a development aid project where we come to the rich and we say, look, why don't you do something nice for the poor? But we are coming to the rich countries and we are saying, look, you have a dysfunctional healthcare system right here. You are spending 18% of your GNP on healthcare and you rank 38th in the world. This is not a good system. It's not working well. And the reason is that so much of this money goes for lawyers, goes for advertisers, and so on. It's all wasted. And so the Health Impact Fund is a much more efficient way to pay for the healthcare that we all need, and reducing, in particular, all the costs of patenting in many jurisdictions. You don't need patents if you're selling at a price that nobody wants to compete with. Litigation, right? Again, you don't need to litigate your right to sell the product because nobody will want to compete with you at these very rock bottom prices. And if they do, if somebody sells the product somehow illicitly or legally, you still get the reward for the health impact achieved. Marketing, yes, you will still do marketing, but very different marketing. You will not do marketing where you repeat over and over again, Vioxx is great, Vioxx is great, Vioxx is wonderful. But rather you will do marketing where you try to find the people who can most benefit from your medicine and try to make sure that these people take the medicine in the best possible way so that the maximum health impact is actually achieved. Counterfeiting is a huge waste in the developing world, and it's of course supported by the fact that these pills are so expensive that people can't afford them. And so people sell lookalikes, which are often adulterated and not the real thing, to desperate people who can't afford the real thing. But if the real thing is available very cheaply, counterfeiters see their market undercut. Gaming, again, is much less attractive if the product is sold very cheaply. Lobbying will be much reduced, and we'll also cut down on deadweight losses, which I'll quickly explain on the next slide. So the present system is basically like this. This is the same demand curve that we had earlier, where now we have a huge gap between the cost of production and the price at which the product is sold. And this big gap means that there are many mutually advantageous trades between willing buyers and willing sellers that cannot be consummated without undermining the monopoly price here. These are so-called deadweight losses, an appropriate word for them because many of the people who cannot get access to the medicine actually die because these are often deadly diseases. And what the Health Impact Fund does, it reduces the price all the way down to the cost curve, and that means that the entire triangle above the cost curve becomes consumer surplus, surplus for the patients who are consuming the medicine. And of course, this will happen only if the innovator voluntarily registers the product, and that the innovator will do only if it makes as much money as it would make on the patent track. But the nice thing is that because the dead weight loss disappears, we as consumers/taxpayers have enough money to pay the innovator as much or more as they would have made on the patent track, and still to have more left over for ourselves. So there's a win-win situation that arises simply from the fact that the dead weight loss disappears. So you can think of the system as dividing the dead weight loss between innovators and patients/taxpayers. So it's, again, a win-win, at least at the group level. At the individual level, if you have no insurance and you're always healthy, you're not going to benefit because your taxes will go up a little bit. If you're Bill Gates, you will also not benefit, even if you get sick a lot, because what you save in costs of drugs will be dwarfed by what you pay in extra taxes. I mean, hopefully Bill Gates pays a lot of taxes, I don't know. But for the vast majority of people, this is a win-win proposition because we benefit and the pharma companies also benefit. Registration is, after all, voluntary. So the Health Impact Fund then avoids the problem of high prices. Medicines are very cheap from day one, cheaper than they would be under generic competition. It ends the neglect of the diseases of poverty, which become now very lucrative targets of pharmaceutical innovation. It alleviates last mile problems, another important point, namely it gives innovators incentives to try to clear away any barriers that may stand between their product and its health impact in particular poor countries. So if the cold chain is a problem, for example, keeping medicines refrigerated all the way to the end user, then the innovators have an incentive to see to it that the cold chain gets established so that their product arrives at the patient in good condition. Because if it is not in good condition, there's no health impact. If there's no health impact, there's no reward. Similarly, if doctors and nurses are leaving the brain drain, again, innovators have an incentive to stem that. If patients don't know how to use the medicine because the package insert is in English or French or Japanese, again, innovators have an incentive to get the thing translated and make sure that patients know how to optimally use the medicine and so on. So whatever the obstacles may be that stand between a medicine and its optimal health impact are obstacles that are money losers for pharmaceutical companies who will then do whatever it takes or try to find out or try to incentivize others to overcome these problems and remove these barriers. In that sense, the Health Impact Fund is a win-win-win all around. It is good for innovators by removing the low esteem in which pharmaceutical companies are held, achieving reputational gains, new markets, new research and development opportunities. It benefits patients, broader arsenal of medicines, greater affordability, and especially also for us, stronger healthcare focus in the delivery of medicines. Under the present system, I make money. If I'm the pharmaceutical company, I make money simply by selling you stuff. It doesn't matter whether you need it. It doesn't matter whether you use it. It doesn't matter whether it helps you or not. Once I've sold you the product, I have made a lot of money. Under the Health Impact Fund system, I make money only if you get better. And that means that I will try to sell my product to those who can really benefit from it with proper instructions so that you take it to optimal effect and so on. So I will be incentivized to really care about my product's impact on your well-being. And finally, governments and taxpayers also benefit because more work is done by effective deployment of pharmaceuticals. Less work needs to be done very expensively in intensive care units and hospitals and so on. There will be much reduced human and economic burdens of disease. And finally, there is the political nice effect that it's not a donor and recipient relation, but it's a joint project where governments of the world, countries of the world collaborate together to do something that is important to both sides, namely to improve healthcare across the globe. So I think I'll stop here and we can discuss it from here on in, focus on the things you're most interested in. Thank you. Should I call in questions? Is that okay? Yeah. And you start?
How do you measure the impact of a particular drug, especially in third world countries where it's difficult to document actual improvement of individual health?
Yeah, so that is really two questions. One question is the metric, and one is the data. So the metric, we use something like quality adjusted life years. So a human life is a plank, 80 inches long, 1 inch high, 80 square inches. And as diseases attack you, you might find that there's morbidity, so the plank gets thinner, or there is mortality and the plank gets shorter. And what diseases nibble away, medicines can avert the nibbling away of. And so that's what drugs get rewarded for the QALYs that they save from being nibbled away by diseases. So that's a well-known methodology. It's been around for about 25 years or 23 years or so, developed by Chris Murray now in Seattle, used to be at Harvard. Now, how do we get the data? Well, the existing data, you're completely right, wouldn't cut it. We don't have the data. We have to collect the data, and that will be expensive. So about 1/10 of the money of the $6 billion would have to go for data collection, raising the data. And here we have to avail ourselves of the power of statistics. So follow up just a representative sample of the product down the pipeline to the end user. For example, embed a microchip in every 1,000th unit that you're selling, see where that ends up. Or do it with the cluster method, where you throw a fly screen over the map and divide the world into 5,000 person neighborhoods and select randomly neighborhoods. And then when you do a particular country, which you do every 3 or 4 years to see how particular drugs are used in the country, you select randomly neighborhoods in that country and then interpolate to the rest of the country. So of course, without telling the pharma companies beforehand which neighborhoods you've selected. So that's the basic way of doing it. There are various other things. You can use clinical trial data as your baseline, even though they are overstating the impact of medicines often by quite a large amount. You can run pragmatic trials and so on. So there are other ways of getting information. One other thing that's maybe worth adding is that the precision that you need is not extremely high. So you just tell the registrants that yes, there will be a certain error which you can statistically predict how large it is likely to be. And that error will, in the long run, come out in the wash, right? Over many different countries, over a number of years that each product is on the Health Impact Fund, that error will wash out to some extent. And to the extent that it doesn't wash out, it's better to allow a certain error than to spend too much money on an even more accurate assessment of the health impact, right? Even the companies benefit if more of the money goes to them and somewhat less money goes into assessment. That also is true with regard to litigation. We don't want to have layers and layers of appeals, and the companies don't want that because they don't want all their money to be wasted on legal battles between the Health Impact Fund and companies. They want as much of the money as possible to go to themselves. Yeah, the green and then yeah.
Would the Health Impact Fund have the same level of benefit for drugs that are more tertiary level care, like say cancer drugs? It seems like this model would work extremely well for conditions that affect, a broad proportion of the population, but for, conditions that affect smaller, percentages of people, but are, kind of equally devastating where they do hit. Yeah. Would it work as well?
Well, we treat all drugs equally, so people can register what they want. But I think what I'm sensing you're driving at is this, that there are some diseases that are less common, and those diseases will be disadvantaged by the system. They're disadvantaged by the old system as well, right? They're always disadvantaged. So if you have 1 million people out there whom you could serve, then other things being equal, that's better for you, a better profit opportunity than having only 100,000. Now, what you could then do, and the orphan drug legislation in the US does that, you could level the playing field, if you like, and give extra rewards for people who tackle diseases that only few people have. Now, that's something that in the world at large we don't want to do. And we don't want to do it because the situation is so desperate for so many people that we feel that the larger disease should be tackled first. We don't want to skew the playing field. So if you did that, if you gave a special advantage, let's say 2 diseases that are equally devastating, and one is afflicts a largish number, let's say 1 million is the cutoff, so anything below 1 million is an orphan disease, something like that. So you have one with 1.2 million, the other has 900,000 patients, and the 900,000 one, however, gets a special boost because it is below the threshold. Then you would direct attention to the 900,000, and it's unclear, if these people are all equally badly off, it's unclear why the smaller number should get preference over the larger number. So for the time being, we don't want to give, also in the interest of simplicity, any special advantage to diseases that fewer people have. Even though, of course, in one sense, it's unfair, right? Why should I be penalized for the fact that my disease happens to be a rare one? But the problem is so large, that the losses in effect that would arise from benefiting some people more would be too large.
I have maybe a similar question, but I have kind of 2 parts, I guess. First, I was wondering how you guarantee that, how a drug company would guarantee that they would regain the costs from the research and design or development. So even if they're having a big impact, how they kind of guarantee that maybe they have a huge cost of development.
Good.
And then secondly, I'm assuming the goal of the health impact fund is that eventually it's working itself out of the job, kind of. So you're working your way down to diseases that have a smaller, or drugs that have a smaller impact, and then eventually it's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, there's actually only one answer to both questions in a sense. So the system is such that it is self-adjusting in the reward rate. So the reward rate, what is the reward rate going to be? How many dollars are you going to get for each quali? Well, I don't know that. I don't know that because it depends on who registers and how much impact each of the registered products is going to have. But I can still make some predictions. What I can predict is this, that if the rate that establishes itself on the Health Impact Fund, driven by demand and supply of innovation, is perceived to be high by the innovators, if they say this is a really good deal, additional registrations will come forward and drive the rate down. Conversely, if the rate is perceived to be lousy and unattractive, then innovators will stay away. Not all of them, because some have a product that can only survive on the Health Impact Fund, but those with a choice will just say, well, we're not registering. So the reward rate will adjust itself to the true cost of innovation plus a certain reasonable profit margin. And that answers your question. It's, of course, true that some products will not make their money back. And in fact, if you now look at the markets as they are, most products do not make their money back. Pharmaceutical companies make the real big profit with a few products, maybe 40% or 35% of their products. The others lose money, but the gainers gain much, much more than the losers lose. And that might very well continue. So there could be products that don't gain, but on the whole, pharmaceutical companies make a good deal of money. So what will happen in the long run? What will happen is that actually not so long run, pretty medium-term run, the reward rate will go up. And that is because, as you said quite rightly, the lowest hanging fruits will be harvested. So there's just going to be less disease burden out there, and so less difference can be made by additional drugs that come on stream. That's a great thing, by the way, for the future, because we may just wipe out some of these diseases, much, much better than just curing them for the rich continuously, waiting until resistance against the drug builds up, and then finding a new drug to give to the rich. So that's a very good thing, but then the reward rate will automatically adjust upward. And the Health Impact Fund could survive forever. It would become less and less effective on a dollar per quali basis, or quali per dollar basis, I should now say. But it would nevertheless always be trained, like a machine, always train attention towards those diseases which can be most cost effectively reduced. And so it's a permanent source of innovation. And we'll always, as far as I can tell, there will always be sick people, and so there will always be need for the Health Impact Fund. It's just a much more efficient way of dealing with diseases than the present way, which is all right for the rich, but still very, very wasteful. Yeah, you and the one behind.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what types of pharmaceutical organizations apply to register with the Health Impact Fund? I'm curious about if it's from predominantly Western countries, or like let's say if India also applies, and like what kind of size or market share these companies have in relation to other ones.
Yeah, so in principle, anybody can apply. And actually, two other things are also eligible for registration. So if you have a traditional medicine and you run some clinical trials on it to find out what is the best way of dosing it and how do you get the optimal health impact, let's say a Chinese or Indian medicine, you can register that for 5 years of rewards. But you didn't really quite invent it, but still, having done the work, you can get 5 years of reward. And the same is true for off-label uses. So if you find that an existing medicine, for example, ivermectin has been found to be good for scabies, and people didn't predict that, right? First river blindness, then scabies. So that's a great medicine, and somebody found that and developed a good regimen for how to administer it and so on. You still get 5 years of rewards. Now, anybody can register. Again, I'm totally neutral. Anybody who has a medicine that they innovated, they can come and register. But as a matter of fact, I think you are right to say that this will give the developing countries and their pharmaceutical industry a leg up. The reason is twofold. In the traditional markets where a lot of work has already been done, like cancer, it's very, very hard for the developing country firms to catch up. They need to spend millions and millions of dollars to get to the cutting edge, because the existing big Western firms already have molecule libraries a mile long. They've already searched through all these different molecules, and you have to repeat that work. They're not going to share it with you, right? But if it's a matter of one of the neglected diseases, basically they don't have a head start. You can compete on a more or less even footing, and in fact you have an advantage because you have patient populations right there, and maybe a supportive government that is really concerned about that particular disease. So I think they will do better than they would do under the old system. And then there's another group, even more important perhaps, that will also do much better. Those are the public-private partnerships or the NGO-type innovators. So Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative is one good example. It was a spin-off of MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. And what they now do is they collect money. They go around begging people for money. Then they innovate, develop a drug. Then they don't charge the usual high prices because they don't want to. And that means that they have to start collecting money all over again to do their second research project. With the Health Impact Fund, they could register, collect a lot of money without harming anybody, and then invest that money into their second research project. So they will, of course, register all their products and will make that a condition of collaborating with private companies.
If I understood what you were saying correctly, before you introduced the Health Impact Fund, you said that when you're kind of developing reforms to eradicate poverty or to try to reduce it, the best reforms will be ones that will open up space for other reforms. So I guess I'm wondering if you can comment on what spaces, what other types of reforms you see the Health Impact Fund creating space for.
Yeah. So the very most immediate thing is that the Health Impact Fund can expand. So when people see how well it works, governments can put in more money. If you double the money, the annual reward pool, you get initially a doubling in the reward rate, but very quickly new registrations will come in, and so you get more medicines now on the Health Impact Fund. A second thing is that the idea about how to innovate, this can be transported into other fields. So two fields that are very plausible and obvious are first agriculture, where we have now pesticide, seeds that don't need a lot of pesticide to thrive, or that don't need a lot of fertilizer or need less water, right? These are very valuable crops, but they are patented, and so in the developing countries can't be used. You've all heard about Terminator seeds and all these sorts of things. So here we can say to agricultural innovators, you make your seeds available for free everywhere in the world, and we will pay you on the basis of results, such as pesticide use reduced, water use reduced, fertilizer reduced, nutrient yield increased, and so on. Another area is green or clean technologies. Again, cost of innovation is a particularly big hurdle in developing countries, where developing countries are often building factories and power plants and so on blueprints that are antiquated and very bad for the environment. simply because the more modern designs cost a lot of money. You have to buy the design. So again, we tell the innovators, license the stuff for free, and we will pay you on the basis of emissions averted. That would be another one. Now, the biggest one, the last thing in the circle, is, and that goes back to the beginning of the lecture, that it will focus attention on this other 99% of the supranational architecture. That we say, look, here is something that we can achieve if we only intelligently take account of the interests of the majority of the human population in designing the stuff. Let's not think about the poor only in connection with development aid. Let's think of the poor when we design these other things and have a rational and moral system.
Could you elaborate a little further on how the money actually gets into the fund, and whether one country, if they have a particular problem with a particular disease, are they the ones primarily financing that, or presumably these people who have certain diseases are all across the world, and how does that coordination happen with the funds that have to go in there to support the system?
Yeah, so you don't know ahead of time what the Health Impact Fund will produce remedies for. So that means that if you are a country that has a particular interest in some specific disease, you have to make your decision behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know whether the Health Impact Fund will or will not lead to a registration of a product that would be particularly useful for you. And we basically open it up for countries. We say countries should join the Health Impact Fund if they want. Some will join, some will not join. We ask for 0.03% of gross national product, which means that we would have 18 billion if everybody joined. Now, I tell you a secret, not everybody is going to join. And so the US, for example, is not going to be an early adopter, if I may say so. And that means that we hope we get the 6. And the 6 would be, for example, the European Union and Brazil. That would get you to 6. China and the US would also get you to 6. So it's doable, but it's not particularly easy. Now, you were asking how the funding would work, or was the other? Or was that already the...
Well, I guess what I didn't understand was the fact that you put money in there without knowing what directly...
Yeah, you basically put money in there knowing that some highly effective drugs will be produced, sometimes ones that you have particularly strong use for and sometimes not. And so it would essentially, it's unpredictable from your point of view, so you take a certain amount of gamble if you are purely self-interested. But then also, we spend a lot of money through the Global Fund, through PEPFAR and so on, buying patented medicines, and we would save, even if the drugs initially would be developing countries sort of diseases, we would still save a lot of money because we have, these expenses, we have lots of troops in tropical regions and so on.
Yeah, it's a similar question to that one. How are you going to incentivize more developed countries when you're especially trying to target some of the more neglected diseases? Like, for example, why would the US want to contribute to a fund that maybe trying to find a treatment for malaria when that affects essentially no one in the US?
Yeah, I mean, you don't get to contribute disease. You get to contribute to the Health Impact Fund as a whole, and so you have to take the bad with the good, so to speak. But in a sense, the problem is much worse than you indicate. The problem is that the Health Impact Fund requires the innovator to sell the product everywhere in the world at cost. And so you might as well have asked an even more damning question, namely, why should anybody join this if they can get the cheap drugs for free? Let other people join, let other countries join. Why should I join? Right? And we have one little incentive built in to join, but it's not a very strong incentive. The incentive is this, that when we measure the health impact, we measure only in the countries that contribute. We don't measure in the countries that do not contribute. And that means that even though the drug will be available at very low prices in those non-contributing countries, there will be no tender loving care expended by the company on trying to market and promote the drug appropriately in that country. But you're right, I mean, the US could just say, thank you very much, dear world. This is a wonderful idea. Just let these cheap drugs come in, let our people benefit, and we will contribute nothing to it. And here the hope is that if it gets up, that position would be a difficult one to maintain politically, that the sense of fairness of at least the rich countries would really militate against that. And I think that most poor countries, they obviously are much greater winners than the world at large, even they win disproportionately. And the poor countries, insofar as they can, I think most of them would come on board. But that is your next.
So, a question: What are the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies like currently, and then how do they change?
Yeah, so the profit margins of pharmaceutical companies are pretty good under the existing system, though they are dramatically declining in recent years. There's been a bit of a pipeline problem, and the pharmaceutical companies would probably, not win as much on the health impact fund as they can on the patent track. On the patent track, some very, very, very big winners are essentially making all the money for the pharma companies. So Lipitor made $13 billion a year, which is more than twice as much as the entire health impact fund is going to distribute. So that's huge, right? And you cannot make, obviously, $13 billion a year on the health impact fund. Even if you were the only drug, you wouldn't get that. So the point here is to say that pharmaceutical companies, of course, they will want to harvest the big bucks on the patent track if they can, but you're not always lucky with your drug. And why wouldn't they want to harvest additional money from the health impact fund track? The 60 billion that is available, 6 billion a year for 10 years, it's not going to be the case that nobody comes forward and wants to claim that money. Somebody is going to claim it, and we're going to get a few pretty good drugs out of that, even if maybe some pharmaceutical companies don't want to play.
I was just wondering who manages the distribution of the drugs, and say in terms of shortage of supply of the drugs at any point in time, who decides where each batch of drug goes to, and in that case, then would geopolitical reasons come into play with countries with probably high bargaining powers? Because I feel like if everyone is donating the same amount, they feel they have just the same entitlement to it. And then in that situation, what do you do when you don't? You have a conflict of who gets the drugs first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's no scarcity of drugs, right? The drugs are paid for by the users or the insurance companies or their governments or whatever. So the cost of the actual manufacture of the drug is covered by the end users. So the only thing that the Health Impact Fund covers is the cost of innovation. It rewards the innovator. And so there's really no reason for there to be any kind of bottleneck. The company that is registering the product with the Health Impact Fund guarantees that it will make the drug available all over the world. And it has every incentive to do that because it doesn't cost it anything, right? It is getting the drug from the manufacturer and it's selling it on at the same price. It's not making any money, but it's also not losing any money on that transaction. But it is gaining money on the drug being widely used and achieving a health impact. So the company has every reason to want the drug to be as widely available as possible to make sure that there's ample supply everywhere where the drug is needed.
But, you can't guarantee the 100% efficiency of the company. I guess what I'm saying is, as of the company producing the drug, it doesn't necessarily have to be a concerted effort to stop production. But are there talks going into strategies or systems to put in place in case there's a failure in production? Because they might not be anticipated, but when they do happen, such
Yes.
issues come into it.
Yes, so that's why we want to say that it's not just the one winning bid, the lowest price bidder, but rather several, maybe 2 or 3. So we say, here is a new drug. We anticipate that we will need about 6 million units of this drug, packages for worldwide consumption per year. And we will auction this off to the lowest bidder, i.e. the company, the generic manufacturer that is offering us the lowest price. And the 3 lowest bids win. The first lowest bid, let's say, gets a half, the second gets a third, and the third gets a sixth of the world contract. And that way we have capacity and know-how in 3 different firms. So if one company burns down, the whole factory burns down or something like that, why then we still have the other 2 that can rev up production. Right? That's the idea. So we do want to be mindful of that.
Do you foresee problems with the distribution, like costs of distribution and issues that may come up, and like just something as simple as infrastructure? Because it seems to me to guarantee that distribution is almost a little unrealistic.
Yeah, so in the distribution, the pharmaceutical innovator who is financially benefiting from the health impact that the drug achieves has a vested interest in trying to solve these problems. And that's essentially what we rely on, that those obstacles that can be cost effectively removed, so that the removal of the obstacle costs less than the additional health impact rewards that you get by removing it, those will be removed. And so whatever they are, so as I said, cold chain is an example, there are just no refrigerators or there's no electricity. So you think of something, you somehow improve the infrastructure, make sure that this obstacle gets removed, proper prescribing, package inserts and so on, whatever the obstacles are, insofar as it's cost effective to tackle them, the innovator will have an incentive to tackle these obstacles. Any other? Yeah?
So even if those obstacles are just based on the fact that the country doesn't have a system set in place to enable the drugs effectively reach people, do the institutions then bear the responsibility for furthering developments per se in those regions?
Yeah, responsibility is putting it too moralistically, right? We are relying here on the profit motive of pharmaceutical companies. This is nothing like an appeal to the moral conscience of pharma companies. That would be a little... So we are appealing to their profit motive. We are saying, well, if you can do something about this problem, you'll get rewarded. So one problem is that there are very significant markups in many poor countries. So drugs come into the country even at a reasonably low price, and then they get marked up by all sorts of middlemen and middlewomen, mostly men, who are in cahoots with the local government, and the government kind of winks at them and lets them mark up prices quite spectacularly. And that means that poor people don't get access, even though the drug comes into the country very cheaply. That happens with drug donation programs sometimes and so on. So people will be hostile to health impact fund registered medicines because they say they're taking away our profit. We're not making much money on this, you know, and they mark it up in some ways and so on. And that's something which, again, pharmaceutical companies will try to rectify. They will try to lobby, for example, to the US government and say, look, you know, we have this very important drug. It's not getting to the Nigerian people. It's not getting to them because it gets marked up so much. Is there anything you can do? Can you intervene with the Nigerian government and see whether you can't? You know, pharmaceutical companies are pretty good at lobbying, and why shouldn't they lobby on the right side for once and try to help overcome some of the problems? The idea is if you give them the right incentives, namely the incentive to achieve health impact, they will use their resourcefulness, hopefully, to clear away the obstacles that they can effectively clear away at cost that is lower than what they will gain thereby. That won't solve all problems, but it will move things in the right direction.
Are there bioethical and quality assessment kind of control methods built into this through the fund, perhaps? Just if the innovator, their number one goal is to achieve like these either numbers or some kind of proof that they're having a health impact. I was just wondering if, depending on the country setting, you work either with the government or something like that, just to make sure there's some kind of oversight.
Yeah, so we have to, that's right, there are a number of problems of that sort. So for example, starting with the generic production of the drug, we don't want manufacturing of medicines to take place under sweatshop conditions. So we have to have a constraint of that sort, right? And we don't want pharmaceutical companies to come into a small African country and push aside the local health establishment and basically elbow their way in and say, okay, move aside, we will now take over your health system and we will make sure that Pfizer drugs will, will do all the good work here and harvest a lot of money and so on. So yes, there have to be constraints and safeguards built into that system for sure.
What about drugs and treatments that kind of have high production costs? I know vaccines are somewhat expensive to make, take a while. How does it deal with that?
Well, they will then be expensive. And so the production cost, the sheer production, it's still, even the expensive ones are not very expensive. I mean, nothing like the prices at which drugs are actually sold, right? So the marginal cost of production is still going to be a pittance compared to what you now pay in the store, even for the cheapest to produce medicines. But anyway, yes, that's just too bad. The cost will then be higher. So let's say that some treatment, very complicated biologic or something, costs $12 a dose, or $12 per treatment. And then it will just, the cost for the end user will just be $12. And there the only saving grace is twofold. One is that the innovator will want to sell it more cheaply in cases where it loses less money on making it cheaper than it gains on the health impact reward. And the second and even more important thing is that organizations such as Médecins Sans Frontières, the Global Fund, whatever, UNICEF, or can step in, DFID, USAID, and can subsidize it and can say, this is a great medicine. Yes, it costs $12. Yes, many people can't afford it. We'll pay $6 or we'll pay $8 and make it affordable to people who are really poor. Right? Much easier to achieve that than if the drug costs $120.
Maybe one last question?
Just comment on the timing of this and temporal and sort of your area under the curve with maximizing the monopoly. Patents are for 17 years. You know, you talk about 10 years. Oftentimes the drugs don't get introduced. These are future events. And I'm envisioning, at least from what you're saying, is that this would happen on day one. You're either in or out.
Yep.
You can't come in and out of this piece. But pricing for drugs changes quite a bit over time as things. And so the Lipitor, you get closer to the period of coming off patent, they drop the prices to drive the generics out of the market. So how does this, it's not quite as simple, and how would you, what's the thought in that process?
Yeah, so the first about the period, the patent periods, the patent clock is 20 years now with the TRIPS agreement and starts ticking at the moment at which you apply for the patent. So that means the clock starts ticking long before the drug hits the market, and the effective patent life, as they call it, which is the patent period after your drug hits the market, is typically in the order of 8 to 12 years. And so that's the reason, that's where the 10 comes from, precisely. We want to match more or less, but we don't want to, we want to basically not follow the example of saying that somehow how long it takes for the patent office to approve something should have a real effect. Everybody should get 10. That's a fair way. Now, switching in and out, you're right. We don't want switching in and out, but if you change your mind, if you have been on the patent system for a year and now want to come over to the Health Impact Fund, you can do that, but you then get the time that you've already been on the patent system reduced by twice, or you get a reduction twice as long. So if you have had 1 year, you lose 2 years on the Health Impact Fund system. Now, with regard to prices, I mean, I realize that what you say is going on with regard to the stuff on the patent track, but on the Health Impact Fund track, the innovator doesn't have much control over the price. The innovator will redo the tender every 3 or 4 years to take advantage of improvements in manufacturing technology, if such there be. So the tender gets repeated, maybe hopefully resulting in a lower price. But that price is the ceiling. The innovator cannot sell above that price, but can sell below. So and that stays flat all the way to the end of the period. And then at the end of 10 years, the innovator has to give zero-priced licenses to generic manufacturers, and the whole thing goes generic. Anybody can then produce it, even if the innovator took out a patent and even if there's time left on the patent.
It would be identical to patent expiration.
Exactly.
Let's join me in thanking Professor.
Good. Thanks.